There is a moment in the sixth season of How I Met Your Mother where the camera holds on Jason Segel's face for approximately 4 seconds after he receives the worst news of his character's life. 4 seconds of silence, no dialogue, no score, just a face processing something it was not prepared to process. Television critics at the time called it one of the most devastating single moments in the history of the sitcom format. They were right. What none of them knew was that the devastation on Jason Segel's face was not entirely a performance. He found out that Marshall Erickson's father was going to die the same way Marshall found out. In the middle of the scene, without warning. I'm talking about a major network production, 8 to 10 million viewers a week at its peak. A scene that has appeared on every serious list of the most emotionally effective moments in sitcom history, and the man at the center of it did not know what was coming until the cameras were already rolling. Not as a rumor, not as a thing someone heard secondhand from a crew member. It was a documented, on-the-record creative decision made by the showrunners and confirmed by the people who made it. And that is only where this story starts. Because once you understand how that scene was built, you cannot stop seeing the same logic operating everywhere else, and how the show constructed 5 full seasons of a father-son relationship before it destroyed it in 60 seconds. In the specific asymmetry between what Allison Hannigan knew walking into that scene and what Jason Segel did not. In the way, the entire industry has spent decades developing an elaborate vocabulary for the craft of performance while almost completely avoiding the ethical question of what it means to use a performer's genuine emotional experience as raw material without their full informed participation in that use. This is a story about what actually happens on a television set when the people running the show decide that the most valuable thing an actor can give them is something the actor cannot manufacture on command. By the time it is finished, you will never watch a moment of genuine seeming television emotion the same way again, because you will understand exactly what it cost the person delivering it. How I Met Your Mother premiered on CBS on September 19, 2005. Created by Carter Bays and Craig Thomas, the show was structured around a premise that was, in retrospect, either ingenious or quietly cruel, depending on how you look at it. The entire series existed as one long story told by a man in the future to his children, which meant the creative team had something almost no other television production possesses from its first episode. They knew how it ended before they began. They knew which characters would live, which relationships would survive, and which ones would not. They knew things the audience would not know for 9 years, and in certain specific cases, they knew things the actors would not know until the moment the cameras were already rolling. The show ran for 9 seasons, concluding on March 31, 2014. Over that span, according to CBS audience measurement data cited in the network's own press materials at the time of the finale, the show regularly drew between 8 and 10 million viewers per episode during its peak years. It was not the highest-rated comedy on television in that era, but in terms of sustained emotional investment from its audience, the kind of investment that generates the devotion that keeps a show alive for nearly a decade, it occupied a category almost entirely its own. What made that sustained investment possible was not the premise. Plenty of shows have clever premises that collapse under the weight of 9 seasons. What made it possible was the show's unusual relationship with time. Most sitcoms operate in an eternal present. The characters exist, the situations recur, and the emotional stakes reset between episodes because nothing is ever truly permanent. How I Met Your Mother was built on the opposite logic. Everything was permanent. Every choice, every relationship, every loss was being told from the future, which meant it had already happened, which meant the show carried a weight of consequence that the sitcom format almost never allows itself. When something broke in that world, it stayed broken. The audience felt that difference even when they could not articulate it. To understand why the Marshall Erickson storyline landed with the force it did, you need to understand what the show had spent 6 years building before the moment it chose to destroy. Marshall Erickson was, in the architecture of the series, the character who grounded everything else. Ted Mosby was neurotic and romantic. Barney Stinson was a comic construct. Robin Scherbatsky was guarded and ambitious. Lily Aldrin was warm, but occasionally ruthless. Marshall was the one character the writers consistently positioned as uncomplicated in his emotional life. He loved his wife. He loved his friends. He loved his father. The relationship between Marshall and his father, Marvin Erickson Sr., played by Bill Fagerbakke, was treated in the show not as backstory texture, but as an active narrative weight. Marvin appeared across multiple seasons as a recurring presence. He and Marshall had inside jokes, shared rituals, a vocabulary of affection that was allowed to take up real screen time without always serving a plot function. The show built that relationship slowly, patiently, and without ever announcing that it was doing so over more than 5 full seasons. It was the longest sustained construction in the entire series. Carter Bays and Craig Thomas have discussed their approach to long-term storytelling in multiple interviews, including extensive conversations with Entertainment Weekly and Vulture during the show's run. Their method was specific and consistent. They planted information seasons before they needed it. They built relationships before they broke them. And they operated on a principle that is not unique to them, but that they applied with unusual discipline. The audience can only feel the destruction of something they have been allowed to love. You cannot shortcut the construction phase. You have to earn the devastation before you can deploy it. By season 6, they had earned it. 5 years of Marvin Erickson. 5 years of Marshall calling his father from college dorm rooms and apartment kitchens. 5 years of a relationship that the audience understood without ever being instructed to understand it. The foundation was fully laid. All that remained was to use it. The episode titled Bad News was the 13th episode of season 6. It aired on January 10, 2011. The premise of the episode on its surface was not a preparation for anything catastrophic. Marshall and Lily were dealing with fertility concerns, pursuing medical answers, navigating the specific anxiety of a couple confronting the possibility that the thing they want most might not come easily. It was an emotionally grounded episode, but not an obviously high-stakes one. Nothing in its first act signaled what its final 60 seconds were going to do. The episode contained a visual device that was, in retrospect, one of the more technically sophisticated pieces of foreshadowing the show ever attempted, scattered throughout the background of nearly every scene, visible if you were paying attention and invisible if you were not, were numbers counting down from 50 to 1. Clocks on walls, license plates, price tags, addresses. The countdown ran through the entire episode without commentary, without being pointed out by any character. It simply existed quietly in the negative space of every frame, moving towards something the viewer did not yet know was coming. The decision to embed the countdown visually rather than dramatically was not a stylistic flourish. It was an argument about how grief actually arrives. It does not announce itself. It does not wait for you to be ready. It runs alongside the ordinary business of your day. The doctor's appointments, the phone calls, the conversations about things that seem important until suddenly they are not, and then it reaches 1, and the ordinary business stops. And what is left is just the fact of the loss with no scaffolding around it. The countdown was the show's way of encoding that argument into the structure of the episode itself. Most viewers did not catch it on first watch. They felt it without seeing it, which is precisely what the show intended. The countdown reached 1 in the episode's final scene. Lily appears outside in the cold. She has just received a phone call. She finds Marshall, and she says his name, the nickname she has for him, and she tells him his father had a heart attack that he did not survive. What the camera captures in the seconds that follow is Jason Segel receiving information he was not prepared for. Not the character. The man. Segel has spoken about the production of this scene in multiple interviews in the years since it aired, including conversations with Howard Stern, with late-night hosts, and in written profiles. The account he has given is consistent across those appearances. The showrunners told him the general nature of Season 6's arc, but withheld the specific timing. He knew, in the abstract way that a working actor knows his character's general trajectory, that a significant loss was coming. What he did not know was that Bad News was the episode. He did not know until the scene was being filmed that the death was happening now, in this moment, on this day of production. By the time he understood what he was being handed, the cameras were already running. What you see on screen is the product of that specific gap. Segel has described the experience of that filming day in terms that are not the language of craft or technique. He has talked about it the way people talk about receiving unexpected news in their own lives. The physical response. The difficulty of maintaining any kind of professional container around something that arrived without warning. The scene required very few takes, according to accounts from the production. It did not require them because Segel had prepared exceptionally. It required very few takes because there was nothing to prepare and therefore nothing to perform. There was only the response. Allison Hannigan, who plays Lily and therefore delivered the death notification in the scene, has also spoken about the production of that moment, including in an interview with People magazine in the years following the episode's broadcast. Her experience of the scene was structurally different from Segel's for a specific reason. She knew. She had to know, because she was the one delivering the information. To perform the scene authentically, to embody the weight of what Lily was carrying before she said the words, Hannigan needed the information in advance. She received it. Segel did not. The two actors therefore arrived at the scene from completely opposite epistemic positions. Hannigan was holding the grief of knowing something that had not yet been said. Segel was about to receive news he had not been told was coming. The scene they filmed together is the product of that asymmetry. And it is that asymmetry, not the writing, not the cinematography, not the score, that is responsible for the quality of what ended up on screen. Carter Bays has discussed the decision to withhold information from Segel in multiple interviews, including a 2011 conversation with Entertainment Weekly shortly after the episode aired. He framed it as a deliberate creative choice made in service of the scene's emotional authenticity. His reasoning was consistent with the logic of the show's entire approach to long-form storytelling. The thing they were trying to create, the specific quality of shock and grief visible in Segel's face, was not a thing that could be rehearsed into existence. It was, by its nature, a one-time event. You could either capture it or you could not. The only way to capture it was to engineer the conditions that would produce it, which meant withholding the conditions from the person whose reaction you needed. That is a production decision made by people who understood their craft and applied it deliberately. It is also a decision that used a performer's genuine emotional experience as raw material for a commercial product without his full informed participation in that use. These two things are both true at the same time, and the fact that the television industry has never developed a coherent ethical vocabulary for that tension is itself a story worth telling. Because the bad news scene is not an anomaly. It is a documented example of a practice that exists throughout the history of dramatic television and film production, applied with varying degrees of deliberateness and varying degrees of acknowledgement after the fact. Alfred Hitchcock's production methods included documented instances of withholding information from actors to generate authentic fear responses, a practice he discussed openly in Francois Truffaut's 1966 book-length interview, Hitchcock, published by Simon & Schuster. In reality television, the genre pioneered the systematic use of manufactured surprise as a production technique, constructing scenarios specifically designed to provoke genuine reactions that could not be scripted. But even in prestige dramatic production, the logic is visible in the historical record more often than the industry typically acknowledges. Directors speak in interviews about the value of the unguarded moment. Writers talk about the first take quality that disappears once an actor fully understands what they are being asked to perform. Producers describe the way certain scenes simply require a performer to encounter something rather than interpret it. The vocabulary is consistent across decades and formats. The ethical framework around it is almost entirely absent. There is a reason for that absence, and it is not accidental. The entertainment industry is structured around the value of the authentic moment at the same time that it is structured to acquire that moment as cheaply as possible. A performance that costs the production nothing beyond the actor's day rate but captures something genuinely unguarded is, from a purely economic standpoint, a more efficient outcome than a performance that required weeks of preparation, emotional coaching, and multiple shooting days to construct. The industry rewards the outcome. It has no mechanism for accounting for what producing that outcome costs the person who delivered it. Contracts cover the performance. They do not cover the experience of performing it. That gap has existed since the first director ever told an actor something on set that they had deliberately not told them in rehearsal, and it has never been closed because closing it would require the industry to treat its performers' interior lives as something other than a resource to be optimized. Jason Segel, speaking about Bad News in 2014 to Howard Stern, described the filming experience as simultaneously the most emotionally demanding and the most authentically meaningful professional moment of his time on the show. He was not describing it as a violation. He was describing it as something that cost him something real and produced something real in return. His account suggests a performer who understood what had been done and found, on reflection, that he was at peace with it, or at minimum that he chose to present himself publicly as at peace with it. But his peace with it does not close the question, because the next performer, the same technique is applied to may not feel the same way, and because there is no industry standard, no SAGAFTRA contractual language, no production norm that governs when this practice is appropriate and when it crosses into something else, each instance is left to the individual judgment of the showrunner doing it. The only thing protecting the performer is the character and professional ethics of the person holding the information. If you are a person who works in or adjacent to the entertainment industry and you encounter a production that routinely uses information asymmetry as a creative tool, the first question worth asking is the same question a careful investor asks about any complex financial structure. Who bears the risk and who captures the benefit? In the Bad News scene, Segel bore the emotional risk and the production captured the creative benefit. His consent was structural rather than specific. He had agreed, by being an actor on a dramatic television show, to encounter difficult material. He had not agreed to encounter this specific material in this specific way on this specific day. The distinction matters even when the outcome is something both parties later describe as valuable. If you are a viewer, what the bad news scene asks of you, in retrospect, is a recalibration of what you are watching when you watch television. The convention of dramatic performance is that you are watching a skilled professional inhabit an imagined experience with craft and intention. The bad news scene offers a different proposition. You are watching in real time a man find out that someone he has spent 6 years treating as a fictional father is suddenly, without warning, gone. The craft is still present, but the thing underneath the craft is not imagined. That is not a problem to be solved. It is a fact to be held. If you watch the scene again, knowing what you now know, here is what to look for. Watch the 4 seconds of silence before Segel's face fully organizes around the information it has received. In a traditional performance, those seconds would be filled with technique, with the deliberate construction of a response that communicates grief to an audience. What you actually see is something smaller and more specific than grief. It is the moment before grief, when the mind is still insisting that a mistake has been made, that the words did not mean what they meant, that there is some version of this sentence that does not end where it ended. That is not a performance choice. That is what the human nervous system does when it receives information it was not expecting. No rehearsal produces it, no technique reproduces it. You can only catch it. Carter Bays and Craig Thomas caught it because they engineered the conditions to catch it. They built 6 seasons of a father-son relationship specifically so that this one scene would land with irreversible force. They withheld the information from their lead actor specifically so that his face would give them something a prepared performance could never give them. And then they broadcast it to somewhere between 8 and 10 million people on a Monday night in January 2011, and the people watching it felt something that television rarely produces at scale anymore. They felt something they could not immediately explain, something that arrived too fast for the standard defenses against emotional manipulation to engage. Something that sat differently from ordinary dramatic feeling because it was underneath the fiction, not entirely fiction at all. That is what the bad news scene was built to deliver. That is what it delivered. And the reason it still gets discussed more than a decade later, the reason it appears on every serious list of the most emotionally effective moments in sitcom history, is not because the writing was perfect or because the cinematography was elegant. It is because somewhere in the production of that scene, the line between a man playing grief and a man experiencing it became genuinely difficult to locate. Marshall Erickson spent the rest of the series carrying the loss of his father. The show gave him that grief as a character engine for its final 3 seasons. But Jason Segel carries something different from that. He carries the knowledge of what it felt like to film a scene in which the fiction and the reality arrived at the same moment, without warning, with the cameras already running. He described it to Howard Stern as the truest thing he ever did on that show. Not the funniest thing, not the best performance, the truest. The countdown was hidden in the background of every scene in that episode, moving toward one, and nobody watching at home caught it until after the scene had already happened and they went back to look. By the time they found all the numbers, the thing they were counting down to had already arrived. That is precisely how Carter Bays and Craig Thomas designed it. They built the system to move too fast for you to see it coming. They built it that way for the audience, and then they built it the same way for their lead actor. And the face you see in those 4 seconds of silence is what it looks like when someone realizes, too late to prepare for it, that the countdown was never about the fiction.